Hello once again, and welcome to another installment of our header and footer builder partial series, where we're taking just a little bit of time to run through these various reusable bits of markup that we use throughout different elements in the builders. And today we're going to chat about carts. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the cart itself, all of that markup is part of WooCommerce. So if you don't have WooCommerce active on your website, you will not see these elements available in the builders. If you happen to add a cart and then at some point turn WooCommerce off, we do have some graceful fallbacks so that on the front end, you don't get any errors, and you can still interact with that element in the back end and delete it if needed. But just keep that in mind when you're playing around with the cart. And then what's really neat is, since we're using the same bit of markup, but then paired with the controls we have and used in the different contexts that we included in, such as the modal or the off canvas, there's really a lot of mileage you guys can get out of this one central piece of code and functionality. So it's a really cool little thing to play around with. You guys kind of know the drill by now, so let me jump in here and inspect the proper cart I want. And we're just going to take some time and run straight down the line and go through these features. The title, if you remove it from the input here, will be completely removed from the template above. So just keep that in mind. And then the next thing you'll see that you might be familiar if you've played around with the search elements already are these placement controls. So all of these items in here, your actual items and then the total and the buttons, are powered by Flexbox. So you can specify the order you want them in. So for example, if you wanted your total to be first and your items to be second, you can do that. And you can just shuffle things around as needed. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the styling you use for one section or one orientation might not look great as you shuffle it around to another spot. So if we swapped our buttons and our items, this looks a little off. Things are a little smushed. So you'll just need to go back and address that and play around with how things look and function. But it's a really nice little feature that gives you a lot more mileage, like we were saying earlier, out of this same bit of markup that you can use in a lot of different ways. So a very cool thing to be playing around with and start off with when you're working on your designs. Next, we have all of our text format controls for the title, which you're probably familiar with by now from the button and various other elements. And then we have a little bit of margin to space that out if we need. Moving to the items. So this is the first section where we're starting to work with the native WooCommerce markup. We have a little bit of a setup box here. You can choose to hide the remove button from the items if you want, and that's just good. Maybe you want to keep that hidden on your mini cart, but allow them to manage their cart in the checkout funnel itself. It's just a nice little toggle to have there. And then you also have this content spacing option, which has to do with the gutter between your image and content here. So if I bump that up, we get a little bit more space, and then I can bring it back down. Finally, we have our background controls, and you'll notice that we've got base and interaction styling for background, border, box shadow, the standard kind of fare. And that has to do with, while you can click on these links, this text and the image to go through to that item, you may want to add just a little bit of a flourish as people are interacting with the cart itself. And this kind of implies, hey, there are some elements in here that you can play around with and use. So that's just a nice little feature that you can use to add just a little bit of a design touch if you so choose. We've got items margin, padding, border radius, box shadow, all the standard kind of stuff you're used to playing around with. And that really allows you to get a lot of different looks with just a little bit of effort here. So actually, let me add, I'll just jump over here. We'll change our preset to ethos. So you'll notice with the ethos cart, we've got a completely different look. We've got our items, they're not directly up against one another. They're kind of spaced out a little bit. We've got equal padding on all sides here. We've got a little bit of an inset box shadow. We're playing around with text shadows on these text pieces. all these little touches can add to a completely different look. You'll see that our total here is a little more, it stands out a little more, it's more bold, and we've actually chosen to make our buttons very subtle here. So there's a lot of variability that you can play around with these set of controls and getting different looks. Let me just change that back to integrity. Next, we have our thumbnail set up. So you can make your thumbnails in your cart as little or as large as you would like. Do keep in mind, if you end up making your thumbnail very tiny, notice how my text here is wrapping. And unfortunately, we don't have much control over this because this has to do with WooCommerce's native markup, which isn't, there are some things we can do to filter it, but we wanted to leave it kind of as untouched as possible. So you do need to keep that in mind a little bit, just because of the way they structure their markup. So just bumping it up a little bit can help. Now, of course, if you have a really long title and this is wrapping, that might bump your quantity down a little bit. So just play around with all that stuff. You'll kind of have a good idea for your content and how it looks and works and how you might want it to appear in here. Then you can also adjust the border radius for those images. So for example, maybe you want to have them be more circular in appearance. And then there's a box shadow control here. So I've got a very subtle little bit of texture going on here. But a little trick with this box shadow control that you may not have played around with yet is you can actually use this to create faux borders if you want. So for example, I might remove that, remove this, and then let's say I would like a little 2 pixel border of something. So I'll make that 2 pixels in the spread, and then here I'm just going to darken that up. And so now notice that I've got this faux border surrounding my images now. So that's a really cool trick to keep in mind, that even though we only have a few controls in some places, that's actually kind of strategically done. One, just because we want to try and keep what we're presenting y'all to work with as lean as possible, but with a little bit of creativity, you can also get a lot of different looks without a specific control in there. So that's a really cool thing to play with. And that will adjust even if you have no radius, a little bit of radius, that shadow will always move with you there. Next, we have our items link text format. So what that is saying is anything that's linked in the cart. So for WooCommerce's markup, that's basically your title here, as well as the remove button if you have that present. So when you're styling this, you're actually styling both of these at the same time. And so some of these will have an effect. For example, if we turn on our text transform, you'll see that our title changed, but our close button doesn't, because that's just a little Unicode character. But if we were to do something like adjust the text color, you'll see both of those changing at the same time. So just something to keep in mind there when you're styling those. And then we have our quantity text format. So this has to do with this line of text right here. And it's nice to just have that little bit of granularity to adjust it and give a little bit of a design flourish. Typically, we don't have a margin control because typically these lines are not very long and they're usually a little smaller. So what we kind of recommend doing is if you need a little bit more spacing between your title and this quantity, this would be the one that you could set a much bigger line height on to adjust how much of a gap you have between these elements here. Other than that, you have complete control with your text format, style, and shadow like you normally do. Next, we have our total section. So that again has to do with this whole div right here. You can adjust the background of that. You have control over the text format of the text within that section. Spacing, so the spacing from all sides, the top, left, right, and bottom of the total. Padding of that box, border radius. You'll kind of start to see these patterns emerge that you get kind of the same styling controls for a lot of these elements. And then finally, we have our buttons container here. So we actually style the buttons container here in the cart section, and then our cart buttons are separate because we're actually for that, kind of utilizing just the styling portion of our anchor partial. So that's why it's kind of broken down into two different sections. And I'll actually walk through a little bit of there's a few little nuances to just kind of be aware of in this cart buttons section when you get to that. So with our container, we actually have it set up as a flex container, so you can play around with the orientation of your buttons. Now again, this might not seem very drastic because the width is not very big here, and I'm also not, I have these styled in a way that they kind of want a little bit of space between them. But you can do a lot to play around with just this. If you remember the ethos preset we were at just a second ago, these buttons were styled much more simply, just like text, and we had them aligned all the way to the right here. So there's a lot you can do with the orientation and then the way you style the buttons themselves. And then you have full control over the background of that container itself, the margin for that container, again, the same kind of controls, padding, border radius, and the box shadow. Now, if we jump to these buttons, we basically have a few design options, but we don't have everything that you're probably used to seeing in the anchor, and that is because we're just using the styling portion of that anchor, and that is because these buttons are part of WooCommerce's markup. So since we don't have full control over what's in there, we can't add in certain features like the image or the icon, as cool as that would be. And we also are using the same styling for both. So just keep that in mind when you're playing around with these buttons. Notice how they're both red. They've got a little bit of an interaction. But there's still a lot you can do with just these more basic kind of options and without going super in depth. And I'll show you a few of those examples with our other presets here. So you guys kind of know how the anchors are styled and look and function, and you can play around with that, of course, as you want. So let me jump over to our modal here, and I'll show you a few tricks that you guys can think of to get certain looks, because there might be some things you're trying to achieve that, at first glance seem a little difficult to get to, but you absolutely can. There's a lot of flexibility with the options that are available to you guys. So one look here is we've got this subtle kind of 1 pixel black border thing going on where it's grouping, like our little header up here. And notice we've moved our subtotal up to the top, right? Below our title, because normally it's down at the bottom there. And then we've got our items and our actions. So how we're doing that is we have 0 padding on our modal content here, and we've placed our first border around that entire modal content area. So that gives you kind of a uniform outer section there to play around with. And then if we hop into our cart, the first thing we're doing is our items themselves have a 1 pixel border on the top, and you'll see that everything else is set to none. So that 1 pixel border on the top of our item is being used as sort of a faux section divider for this little header area, but it kind of gives the visual impression of a header you've set aside. And the spacing we're getting in here is on, you'll notice my title. So this 25 pixels is kind of the spacing I've chosen to use in all of these areas, like around here. Got 25 pixels on the top, right, and left of our title. And then we have a little 10 pixel bottom margin, which is separating the title from the subtotal here. And then if I jump over to my total, you'll see I'm using a little bit of margin again to space out around here. So play with that. Play with that idea of how can I use margins? How can I use the dimensions of where different elements are positioned to achieve different looks. It's a really cool thing to play around with. And then we've got our buttons here. So on the buttons container itself, you'll see that we don't have anything. And that is because on our cart buttons here, we're doing a little bit of magic. So what we're doing is we've added our 1 pixel black border to every side of the button here. And then what we're doing is we're saying we're using this calc CSS function. Again, I've shown this in a few videos. If you guys are not familiar with the calc function, definitely go read up on it. It's a very useful CSS tool that allows you to achieve a lot of different cool looks, especially in situations like this where you might need to be a little more explicit with some options. But we're telling these buttons to be 50% width plus 1 pixel. Now that's because we're using a negative margin here to pull our button in on itself. So this is kind of an overlapping trick that we've also discussed in some other areas. But notice if I were to set that back to 0, we've got a little bit of a gap in there now. Moving this back to 1 ensures that these offsets that I've used here are getting added back in, and now I'm getting a full width button to go against the edge of our modal here. So lots of cool stuff you can do even with having to utilize the same styling for both of these buttons. The first thought might be, well, I wish I could add a border to just the left of this one and play around with it. And you can still achieve those looks with just a little bit more effort here using some of these tricks. Similarly, we've got our off canvas area here, and this is just using the renew preset. And again, we're doing a little bit of creative layout here to achieve a certain look. So if I were to inspect my total, you'll see that the total has the dark blue background color here. And then we've got some padding on the top and the bottom, which is spacing this out. And again, remember this total is full width all the time, just like these button containers are. And then for the buttons themselves, we've put that background color on the button, and then we've made them 50% width here because we're not using any borders or trying to do any tricks like that. But we have that same padding that was on the top here. It's on the bottom here, and that's how we're getting this look of kind of a box that is containing all these elements. But really, it's just a creative use of laying out the elements that are already there. Using color. If we were to change the background color on this button on hover, you would see that the dimensions of it are kind of off. So that's why we've chosen to just use the color transition, because it makes it much more uniform and clean to look at. So that is basically the run through of the cart. I hope that kind of covers any questions you guys might have about it, and I hope you can see the layout potential that is there in playing around with the ordering of things and how you want to set stuff up. So thank you guys very much for watching, and we appreciate it very much.